The radar screen painted a terrifying picture. An unidentified aircraft, moving faster than anything in the known inventory, had just crossed into restricted airspace over the Pacific. Every military installation from Hawaii to California was scrambling to respond, but there was only one pilot close enough to intercept. The same pilot whose instructors had written, "lacks natural flying ability," on her academy evaluation. The same pilot whose classmates had nicknamed Crash Landing Casey after her disastrous simulator performances. In 47 minutes, Lieutenant Casey Martinez would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are forged in the crucible of their own failures. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for youth. Morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine runways of the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, but Casey Martinez barely noticed the scenic beauty as she hurried toward the flight simulation building. Her worn flight bag bounced against her hip, stuffed with extra notebooks and study guides that most cadets didn't need. While her classmates seemed to absorb aerodynamics and tactical procedures effortlessly, Casey had to fight for every concept, every principle, every point on her evaluations. At 21, Casey looked younger than her years, standing barely 5'4" with determined brown eyes behind standard issue glasses. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her uniform was always perfectly pressed, a small act of defiance against the chaos that seemed to follow her everywhere else. She had grown up in a working-class family in Phoenix, Arizona, where her father Miguel worked as an aircraft mechanic at Sky Harbor Airport, and her mother Elena taught elementary school. Neither parent had attended college, let alone a military academy, but they had instilled in Casey an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. The flight simulation lab was already buzzing with activity when Casey arrived. Rows of sophisticated cockpit replicas filled the space, each one connected to powerful computers that could simulate everything from routine training flights to complex combat scenarios. The familiar smell of electronics and cleaning solutions mixed with the nervous energy of cadets preparing for their morning evaluations. Casey's assigned simulator was number 7, the same machine where she had crashed a virtual F-16 3 times the previous week. As she settled into the familiar seat and began running through her pre-flight checklist, she could hear the conversations from nearby simulators. Her classmates discussed weekend plans, shared jokes about their instructors, and complained about assignments with the casual confidence of people who had never truly struggled with anything academic. "Martinez, you're up first today," announced Captain Robert Shaw, the chief flight instructor. Shaw was a decorated combat pilot who had flown missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, his chest adorned with ribbons that told stories of courage and skill that Casey could only dream of achieving. But when he looked at her academic record, she could see the disappointment in his eyes, the resignation of someone who had concluded that some people simply weren't meant to fly. Casey nodded and activated her simulation program. Today's scenario was a basic air-to-air combat exercise, the kind of fundamental dogfighting that every fighter pilot needed to master. The virtual sky appeared on her screens, painted in the brilliant blue of a cloudless afternoon. Her simulated F-16 started at 15,000 feet, with enemy aircraft approaching from multiple vectors. What happened next was a familiar disaster. Casey's first mistake came during the initial intercept, when she misjudged the enemy's closing speed and found herself in a defensive position before the engagement had properly begun. Her second mistake was overcompensating with aggressive maneuvering that bled away her aircraft's energy, leaving her vulnerable to counterattack. By the time the simulation ended 4 minutes later, her virtual F-16 had been shot down twice and had failed to score a single hit on enemy targets. The debriefing was conducted in front of the entire class, a military tradition that was supposed to promote learning through shared experience, but often felt more like public humiliation. Captain Shaw pulled up Casey's flight data on the main display, showing her erratic flight path in stark contrast to the smooth, efficient maneuvers that characterized successful fighter pilots. "Cadet Martinez," Shaw began, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow student. "Your spatial awareness remains problematic. Look at this turn sequence here." He highlighted a section of her flight path with a laser pointer. "You're flying like you're trying to muscle the aircraft through maneuvers instead of working with its aerodynamic properties. Fighter pilots need to think in 3 dimensions, anticipate enemy movements, and maintain energy management throughout the engagement." Casey felt her cheeks burn as snickers rippled through the classroom. Cadet Jennifer Walsh, who consistently scored in the top 5% of every evaluation, leaned over to whisper something to her neighbor that produced barely contained laughter. Casey had heard the whispers before, the speculation about how someone with her academic record had even been accepted to the academy. "Furthermore," Shaw continued, "your reaction time to threats remains well below acceptable parameters. In real combat, hesitation measured in fractions of seconds can mean the difference between life and death. I'm concerned that your fundamental approach to flying needs serious reevaluation." The criticism continued for another 10 minutes, each point delivered with clinical precision but devastating effect. Casey's tactical decision-making was consistently poor. Her energy management showed no improvement over previous evaluations. Her situational awareness was inadequate for combat operations. By the time Shaw concluded with, "I strongly recommend additional simulator hours before your next evaluation," Casey felt like she had been systematically dismantled. But the real blow came after class, when she overheard a conversation between 2 of her instructors in the hallway outside the simulation lab. Major Patricia Coleman, who taught advanced tactics, was speaking with Captain Shaw in voices they thought were private. "I don't understand how Martinez got this far," Coleman was saying. "Her test scores are barely passing, her flight performance is consistently poor, and she doesn't seem to have any natural instinct for aviation. Some people just aren't meant to be pilots." "I know," Shaw replied with obvious frustration. "But the Academy has invested too much time and resources to wash her out now, unless she fails completely. We'll keep evaluating, but honestly, I can't see her making it through advanced training, let alone combat qualification." Casey pressed herself against the wall, fighting back tears as she listened to her professional death sentence being pronounced by the people whose approval she desperately needed. The conversation continued with technical discussions about her specific deficiencies, each critique feeling like another nail in the coffin of her military aviation dreams. That evening, Casey sat alone in her dormitory room, staring at a letter from home that had arrived that morning. Her parents' words of encouragement and pride felt like mockery in light of her daily failures. They believed in her so completely, trusted so absolutely in her ability to achieve her dreams, that she couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them with the truth about her struggles. Her roommate, Sarah Chun, was a model cadet who excelled in every subject and whose name regularly appeared on the Academy's honor lists. Sarah tried to be supportive, but Casey could see the confusion in her eyes when she watched Casey struggle with concepts that came naturally to everyone else. "Maybe you should talk to the Academic Support Center," Sarah suggested gently. "Sometimes a different teaching approach can make all the difference." Casey nodded politely, but she had already exhausted every available resource. She had attended extra study sessions, worked with tutors, and spent countless hours in additional simulator time. The problem wasn't lack of effort or inadequate instruction. The problem was that she seemed fundamentally unsuited for the demands of military aviation. Late that night, Casey walked to the Academy's memorial wall, where the names of graduates who had died in service were etched in black granite. She ran her fingers over the names, reading the brief descriptions of their final missions. Most had died in combat, their aircraft shot down while performing their duty to defend American interests around the world. But a few had died in training. Accidents, victims of the unforgiving nature of high-performance aviation. Standing there in the darkness, Casey made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She could quit, accept that flying wasn't her calling, and find another way to serve her country. Or she could continue fighting, enduring the humiliation and criticism, betting everything on the possibility that persistence might eventually overcome natural limitation. The memorial wall offered no easy answers, but it reminded her that every name etched in stone had once been a young cadet struggling with their own doubts and challenges. Some had overcome their obstacles through talent, others through determination, and a few through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Casey Martinez chose to fight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 months into her second year at the academy, Casey's situation had deteriorated from challenging to nearly hopeless. The Advanced Flight Training Program had introduced complex multi-aircraft scenarios, electronic warfare simulations, and precision weapons delivery exercises that pushed even the most talented cadets to their limits. For Casey, each new challenge felt like climbing a mountain with weights strapped to her ankles. The morning of November 15th brought the kind of crisp Colorado weather that made flying a joy for most pilots, but Casey approached the flight line with her usual mixture of determination and dread. Today's exercise was Formation Flying 301, an advanced course that required 4 aircraft to operate as a coordinated unit while navigating through hostile airspace. The simulation would test everything from radio communication protocols to split-second tactical decision-making under pressure. Casey had been assigned to Blue Flight, a 4-ship formation led by Cadet James Mitchell, whose natural flying ability had earned him the unofficial title of Golden Boy among both instructors and fellow students. Mitchell possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of aircraft dynamics that couldn't be taught, the ability to make his F-16 simulator dance through the sky as if it were an extension of his own body. His wingmen were equally impressive. Todd Harrison, who came from a military family and had been around aircraft his entire life, and Marcus Johnson, whose mathematical precision in calculating intercept angles and energy management made him a favorite among the instructors. And then there was Casey, assigned to the number 4 position, the spot traditionally reserved for the least experienced or least capable pilot in the formation. She understood the message behind the assignment, but she was determined to prove that she belonged in the cockpit alongside her more gifted classmates. The briefing room was filled with the familiar pre-flight energy as the 4 cadets gathered around a large tactical display showing their mission parameters. The scenario was designed to simulate a deep penetration strike into enemy territory, with their formation tasked to escort friendly bombers through a gauntlet of hostile fighters and surface-to-air missile systems. "All right, Blue Flight," announced Major Lisa Rodriguez, their instructor for the advanced course. Rodriguez was a legend in Air Force circles, a combat veteran who had flown over 200 missions during her deployments to the Middle East. Her reputation for brutal honesty and impossibly high standards had earned her the nickname, the Executioner, among the cadets. Today's scenario will test your ability to maintain formation integrity under combat stress while adapting to dynamic threat environments. Rodriguez activated the display, showing a 3-dimensional map of the simulated battlefield. Red symbols marked enemy aircraft positions, surface-to-air missile sites, and electronic jamming stations. Blue symbols showed friendly forces, including the bomber formation they were assigned to protect. "Your primary objective is bomber escort," Rodriguez continued. "Secondary objectives include suppressing enemy air defenses and maintaining air superiority over the target area. Mission duration is estimated at 45 minutes, during which you will face multiple waves of enemy fighters, using realistic threat patterns based on current intelligence assessments. Casey studied the tactical display, trying to memorize the positions of threat systems and identify potential choke points where enemy fighters might concentrate their attacks. She had spent the previous evening reviewing similar scenarios, analyzing successful missions flown by previous classes, and practicing radio communication procedures until she could recite them in her sleep. Mitchell stepped forward to address his flight. As formation leader, he was responsible for coordinating their tactics and ensuring mission success. His confidence was evident in every gesture, the easy assurance of someone who had never experienced serious failure. "Blue Flight, here's how we're going to handle this," he began, using the laser pointer to trace their planned route. "We'll maintain a defensive wheel formation during the initial penetration, with Blue 3 and 4 providing high cover while Blue 1 and 2 engage immediate threats. Casey, I need you to focus on maintaining position and following my lead. Don't try to be a hero out there." The comment stung, but Casey nodded professionally. She understood that Mitchell was trying to protect both her and the mission by keeping her role simple, but the implication was clear. She was considered the weak link in their formation. The simulation began with all 4 aircraft launching from a forward operating base in simulated friendly territory. Casey settled into her cockpit, running through her pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. If she couldn't match her classmates' natural flying ability, she could at least be absolutely perfect in her procedures and preparation. The initial phase went smoothly. Blue Flight formed up according to plan, with Casey taking her position as the trailing aircraft in the formation. The virtual landscape scrolled beneath them as they climbed to their assigned altitude, and for a brief moment, Casey allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of flying in perfect formation with 3 other aircraft. That satisfaction lasted exactly 14 minutes. The first wave of enemy fighters appeared on radar as they crossed into hostile territory. 8 bogies, approaching from multiple vectors in a coordinated attack designed to split up the formation and isolate individual aircraft. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio with calm authority as he directed their defensive response. "Blue Flight, bandits 12 o'clock high, 8 contacts. Blue 3 and 4, take the northern group. Blue 1 and 2 will handle the southern group. Maintain formation integrity and watch your mutual support." Casey acknowledged the order and turned toward her assigned targets, but almost immediately, everything began to unravel. The enemy fighters were using advanced tactical maneuvers that she had studied, but never successfully executed in practice. They employed vertical separation, timing their attacks to arrive simultaneously from different altitudes, creating a 3-dimensional puzzle that overwhelmed her already limited spatial awareness. Her first mistake came when she lost sight of Harrison during a defensive turn. In her effort to track an enemy fighter, she had inadvertently separated from her wingmen, violating one of the fundamental rules of formation flying. The gap in their defensive coverage allowed an enemy aircraft to penetrate their formation and attack the bombers they were supposed to protect. "Blue 4, where are you?" Harrison's voice carried an edge of frustration as he tried to re-establish visual contact. "I've lost sight. Need you back in position." Casey rolled her aircraft and pulled hard to rejoin the formation, but the high G maneuver cost her airspeed and left her vulnerable to attack. An enemy fighter that had been tracking her patient patience chose that moment to strike, positioning itself perfectly for a simulated missile shot. "Blue 4, break right now." Mitchell's voice was sharp with alarm, but Casey's response was a fraction of a second too slow. The simulation registered a direct hit, and her screens flashed with the red warnings that indicated her virtual aircraft had been destroyed. The humiliation was complete and public. Not only had she been shot down, but her failure had compromised the entire mission. The bomber formation she was supposed to protect had taken casualties because of the gap in their defensive coverage, and her 3 wingmen were now forced to continue the mission with reduced numbers. Casey sat in her simulator cockpit, staring at the red aircraft destroyed message on her screens, while the rest of Blue Flight continued their mission without her. Through her headphones, she could hear their radio chatter as they adapted to her absence, reorganizing their tactics on the fly to compensate for her failure. The debriefing that followed was one of the most brutal experiences of Casey's military career. Major Rodriguez used her failure as a teaching example for the entire advanced flight class, dissecting each mistake with surgical precision while Casey sat in the front row, forcing herself to maintain professional composure. The breakdown began here, Rodriguez announced, highlighting Casey's flight path on the main display. Blue 4 failed to maintain formation discipline during the initial threat response. This separation created a gap in defensive coverage that the enemy exploited effectively. The analysis continued for 20 minutes, each point reinforcing Casey's inadequacy as a fighter pilot. Her spatial awareness was fundamentally flawed. Her threat prioritization showed dangerous confusion under pressure. Her formation flying was inconsistent with combat requirements. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. As the formal debriefing concluded, Mitchell approached Casey with what appeared to be an attempt at encouragement. "Look, Martinez," he said, his voice carrying what he probably thought was kindness. "Maybe it's time to consider other career options. The Air Force needs good people in logistics, maintenance, intelligence analysis. Not everyone is cut out to be a fighter pilot, and there's no shame in finding where you really belong." The words hit Casey like a physical blow. Coming from her formation leader, someone whose opinion carried weight with both instructors and fellow cadets, it felt like an official verdict on her military aviation career. Mitchell wasn't being cruel. He was being practical, offering what he saw as realistic advice to someone who was clearly struggling beyond her capabilities. That evening, Casey found herself walking alone across the academy grounds, past the dormitories where her classmates were probably celebrating successful missions or studying for upcoming exams. The November air was cold enough to see her breath, and the lights of Colorado Springs twinkled in the valley below. She stopped at a bench overlooking the football stadium, the same spot where she had made her decision to continue fighting 3 months earlier. But now, surrounded by mounting evidence of her inadequacy, that decision seemed like naive optimism, rather than determined courage. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "Hope your training is going well, Mia. Your mother and I are so proud of everything you're accomplishing. Love you." Casey stared at the message, feeling the weight of her parents' expectations and her own failures. They believed in her so completely, trusted so absolutely in her ability to achieve her dreams, that the thought of disappointing them felt almost unbearable. But sitting there in the darkness, Casey realized that the choice wasn't really between success and failure. The choice was between giving up on her dreams or finding a way to transform her weaknesses into strengths. Every great fighter pilot in history had faced moments of doubt, periods when their skills seemed inadequate to the demands placed upon them. The difference between those who succeeded and those who quit wasn't natural talent. It was the willingness to continue fighting when continuation seemed impossible. Casey Martinez stood up from the bench, pulled out her phone, and sent a message to Major Rodriguez requesting additional simulator time. If she was going to fail, she would fail after giving everything she had to give. The war for her dreams was far from over. Casey's request for additional simulator time led her to an unexpected encounter that would change the trajectory of her entire military career. Major Rodriguez had approved her request with what seemed like reluctant sympathy, assigning her to evening sessions when the simulation lab was typically reserved for remedial training and experimental programs. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Casey first met Master Sergeant Daniel Boole, Williams was a maintenance supervisor who had been working late on one of the simulator systems when Casey arrived for her 2,100-hour session. At first glance, he seemed like an unlikely person to offer aviation advice. At 53, Williams was a career-enlisted man with graying hair, weathered hands, and the kind of practical demeanor that came from 30 years of keeping complex machines operational. His flight suit was stained with hydraulic fluid and bore the patches of multiple squadrons, but notably absent were any pilot wings. "You're the cadet who's been booking extra sim time," Williams observed as Casey signed in for her session. His voice carried the gravelly tone of someone who had spent decades around jet engines, but there was no mockery in his expression, just professional curiosity. "Yes, Master Sergeant. Just trying to improve my performance," Casey replied, expecting the conversation to end there. Most enlisted personnel maintained appropriate professional distance from cadets, and she had learned not to expect encouragement from anyone connected to her training program. But Williams surprised her by pulling up a chair next to her assigned simulator. "Mind if I watch? Been working on these machines for 15 years, but I don't often get to see them used for actual training." Casey hesitated. Having someone observe her practice sessions felt like inviting additional criticism, but Williams' request was reasonable, and his rank demanded respectful compliance. "Of course, Master Sergeant." What followed was unlike any training session Casey had experienced. As she worked through her standard flight scenarios, Williams remained silent, occasionally leaning forward to study her instrument readings or flight path displays. He didn't offer commentary or criticism, just watched with the focused attention of someone analyzing a complex mechanical problem. After Casey completed her second scenario, a basic air-to-air engagement that ended with her usual disappointing results, Williams finally spoke. "Can I ask you something, Cadet? When you're flying, what are you thinking about?" The question caught Casey off guard. Her instructors typically focused on specific technical errors or tactical mistakes, but Williams seemed interested in something more fundamental. "I'm thinking about everything, I suppose. Airspeed, altitude, enemy positions, formation discipline, threat assessment. Trying to process all the information and make the right decisions." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "That's your problem. Right there, you're flying with your head instead of your gut." Casey frowned. "Master Sergeant, I don't understand." "Fighter pilots need to think tactically, process information quickly." "Sure they do," Williams interrupted gently. "But not during the fight itself. You know how many pilots I've worked with over the years? Hundreds. The best ones. The ones who come back from missions when others don't. They all have one thing in common. When the shooting starts, they stop thinking and start reacting." Williams stood and walked to the simulator's control panel, studying the displays that showed Casey's performance data. "You know what your problem is? You're trying to be perfect instead of trying to be effective. Every move you make, you're second-guessing yourself, calculating whether it's the right decision. By the time you decide to act, the opportunity is gone." The critique was unlike anything Casey had heard from her instructors, who typically focused on technical proficiency and adherence to established tactics. Williams was suggesting that her fundamental approach to flying was flawed, that her analytical nature was actually a liability in combat situations. "But Master Sergeant," Casey protested, "if I don't think through my decisions, I'll make even more mistakes." Williams smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, Casey felt like someone was talking to her as an equal rather than a failing student. "Let me tell you a story, Cadet. Back in '03, I was deployed to Balad Air Base in Iraq. We had this pilot, Captain Sarah Brooks, who was probably the worst simulator pilot in her squadron. Her instructors back in training had written her up for poor spatial awareness, slow reaction times, all the same stuff I heard about you." Casey's attention was completely focused now. Williams had her full attention as he continued his story. Brooks was assigned to a close air support mission, providing cover for ground troops who were pinned down by enemy fire. The mission went sideways when surface-to-air missiles started launching from positions that weren't supposed to be there. 2 aircraft in her flight took hits and had to return to base. Brooks was alone, low on fuel, with troops on the ground depending on her. Williams paused, studying Casey's expression. You know what she did? She stopped thinking, stopped calculating, stopped worrying about perfect tactics and textbook procedures. She flew by instinct, using the terrain and her aircraft's capabilities in ways that no instructor had ever taught her. She kept those troops alive until reinforcements arrived. And she did it because she trusted her gut instead of her head. The story resonated with Casey in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She had spent so much time trying to match her classmates, natural abilities that she had never considered whether her different approach might actually be an advantage under the right circumstances. Master Sergeant, how do I learn to stop thinking? So much? Williams returned to his chair, his expression serious. That's the wrong question, Cadet. You don't stop thinking. You learn to think faster. Right now, you're processing information sequentially, like a computer running through a checklist. Combat pilots process information in parallel, seeing the whole picture at once. He activated the simulator's replay function, showing Casey's most recent engagement from multiple perspectives. Look at this turn sequence here. You saw the enemy aircraft, calculated the intercept angle, planned your maneuver, and then executed it. That whole process took almost 3 seconds. In real combat, you'd be dead twice over. Williams highlighted different sections of the engagement, showing Casey how her analytical approach had consistently put her at a disadvantage. But watch what happens if you trust your initial instinct instead of second-guessing yourself. He rewound the scenario and had Casey fly it again, but this time with specific instructions to act on her first impulse rather than calculating optimal solutions. The result was dramatically different. Her movements were less precise but more fluid. Her reactions faster even if they weren't textbook perfect. You see that? Williams pointed to her flight path display. Your first instinct was actually correct most of the time. You talked yourself out of good decisions by overthinking them. Over the next 2 hours, Williams worked with Casey on developing what he called intuitive flying. Instead of analyzing every decision, she learned to trust her subconscious processing of the tactical situation. Instead of calculating perfect solutions, she focused on good enough solutions delivered quickly. The transformation wasn't immediate, but Casey could feel something shifting in her approach to flying. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she was learning techniques that seemed to work with her natural thinking patterns rather than against them. As the session concluded, Williams gathered his tools and prepared to leave. But before departing, he turned back to Casey with one final piece of advice. Cadet, your instructors aren't wrong about your technical deficiencies. You do need to improve your formation flying, your tactical knowledge, your energy management. But they're making a mistake by trying to turn you into someone you're not. The Air Force doesn't need another James Mitchell. It needs the first Casey Martinez. Williams paused at the door. I'll be working late again tomorrow night if you want to continue these sessions. But remember, what we're doing here isn't about fixing what's wrong with you. It's about discovering what's right with you. After Williams left, Casey remained in the simulator for another hour, practicing the techniques he had shown her. For the first time in months, flying felt natural rather than forced, intuitive rather than calculated. She was beginning to understand that her struggles hadn't been a sign of inadequate ability, but of misapplied strengths. The journey from struggling cadet to competent pilot was far from complete, but Casey Martinez had finally found someone who believed that her different approach to flying might actually be an advantage rather than a liability. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Master Sergeant Williams had given her something more valuable than technical instruction. He had given her permission to be herself. 6 weeks after her first session with Master Sergeant Williams, Casey faced the most challenging evaluation of her academy career, the Comprehensive Combat Assessment, a grueling 3-day exercise that would determine whether cadets advanced to the final phase of pilot training or were eliminated from the program entirely. Unlike the routine simulator sessions that had defined her struggles, the CCA involved real aircraft, actual flight conditions, and performance standards that had no margin for the kind of mistakes that had plagued her throughout training. Evaluation would take place at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas, where Casey and 47 other cadets would fly T-6 Texan trainers in increasingly complex scenarios, designed to test every aspect of their aviation skills. The T-6 was a far cry from the F-16 simulator she had grown accustomed to, but it was real flight with real consequences for failure. Casey arrived at Laughlin on a sweltering Monday morning in early May, the Texas heat already shimmering off. The tarmac as maintenance crews prepared the training aircraft for the week's activities. The atmosphere among the cadets was tense with anticipation and barely contained anxiety. Everyone understood that this was their final opportunity to prove they belonged in military aviation. Her assigned instructor for the evaluation was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, a combat veteran who had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross during operations in Syria. Hayes had a reputation for being fair but uncompromising, someone who evaluated cadets based on performance rather than potential. She greeted Casey with professional courtesy but no warmth, making it clear that their relationship would be strictly business. Cadet Martinez, Hayes began during their initial briefing. I've reviewed your training records from the academy. Your academic performance is adequate, but your flight evaluations show significant inconsistencies. This assessment will determine whether those inconsistencies represent correctable deficiencies or fundamental unsuitability for military aviation. The first day focused on basic airmanship skills, takeoffs, landings, navigation, and emergency procedures. Casey approached the T-6 with the same methodical preparation that had become her trademark, conducting her pre-flight inspection with meticulous attention to detail. The aircraft felt different from the simulators she had trained on, more responsive and immediate, with subtle vibrations and sounds that provided tactile feedback about its performance. Williams' training proved invaluable during her first flight. Instead of overthinking every control input, Casey allowed herself to feel the aircraft's responses and react accordingly. When turbulence caused unexpected rolling motion, she corrected instinctively rather than calculating the precise control inputs required. When her altitude drifted slightly during a navigation leg, she made smooth corrections based on visual cues rather than rigid adherence to instrument readings. The difference was immediately apparent to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who observed the flight from the T-6's rear seat. Casey's flying was smoother and more confident than her training records had suggested, though still lacking the natural precision that characterized the most gifted pilots. Better than I expected, Hayes commented after they landed. Your basic airmanship is solid, though I noticed some hesitation during the stall recovery exercise. We'll work on that tomorrow. Day 2 introduced tactical flying, low-level navigation, formation procedures, and simulated combat maneuvers. This was where Casey's previous struggles had been most pronounced, and she approached the morning briefing with considerable anxiety. The other cadets seemed relaxed and confident, discussing the day's scenarios with the easy familiarity of people who had never seriously doubted their abilities. Casey's first surprise came during the formation flying exercise. Her previous disasters had occurred in simulators where spatial relationships were represented on screens, rather than experienced through direct visual contact with other aircraft. Flying in actual formation with real aircraft 30 feet away required a different kind of awareness, one that seemed to play to her strengths rather than her weaknesses. Blue flight, "This is Blue Lead," announced Cadet Ashley Thompson, one of the Academy's top performers who had been selected as formation leader. "Form up in fingertip formation, altitude 8,000 feet. Casey smoothly moved her T6 into position, using visual references to maintain precise spacing with the other aircraft. The mathematical relationships that had seemed abstract in simulator training became intuitive when she could see the actual geometric patterns formed by the four-ship formation. Her analytical mind processed the visual information naturally, calculating relative positions and movement vectors without conscious effort. "Blue 4, excellent position," Hayes commented from the back seat. "Maintain current spacing." The formation proceeded through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers, echelon turns, altitude changes, and tactical spreads designed to test each pilot's ability to maintain formation integrity under varying conditions. Casey found herself anticipating the lead aircraft's movements, adjusting her position proactively rather than reacting to changes after they occurred. But the real test came during the afternoon's air-to-air combat exercise. Casey was paired against Cadet Robert Kim, whose simulator performance had consistently ranked in the top 10% of their class. The scenario was simple: a 1-versus-1 engagement beginning from neutral positions, with the objective of achieving a simulated missile lock on the opposing aircraft. As Casey strapped into her T6 for the engagement, she recalled Williams' advice about trusting her instincts rather than overthinking tactical decisions. The analytical approach that had served her well during formation flying might be a liability in the dynamic environment of air combat, where success depended on rapid adaptation to constantly changing conditions. The engagement began with both aircraft climbing to the designated altitude, their paths converging toward the center of the assigned airspace. Casey could see Kim's T6 in the distance, a small speck against the Texas sky that gradually resolved into the distinctive silhouette of her opponent's aircraft. "Fight's on," announced the range controller, signaling the beginning of combat. Kim immediately executed an aggressive climbing turn, attempting to gain both altitude and position for an advantageous attack. It was a textbook opening move, the kind of tactic that typically succeeded against less experienced opponents. But instead of responding with her own textbook counter, Casey did something unexpected. She dove while Kim climbed for altitude advantage. Casey pointed her nose toward the ground and accelerated, trading potential energy for kinetic energy in a maneuver that seemed counterintuitive but felt instinctively correct. The T6's airspeed increased rapidly as she descended, giving her the energy advantage that Kim was trying to gain through altitude. "Interesting choice," Hayes observed from the back seat, her tone neutral but attentive. Kim, committed to his climbing attack, found himself in an awkward position. He had gained altitude but lost airspeed, while Casey had gained speed but sacrificed height. In simulator training, this situation would have been analyzed through energy management calculations and optimal intercept geometry. But in the real aircraft, Casey simply felt what needed to happen next. She pulled her T6 into a vertical climb, using her accumulated airspeed to rocket upward past Kim's position. The sudden reversal caught him completely off guard, transforming Casey from defender to attacker in a matter of seconds. As she climbed through Kim's altitude, she had a perfect opportunity for a simulated missile shot. "Blue 4, excellent position," Hayes commented from the back seat. "Maintain current spacing." The formation proceeded through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers, echelon turns, altitude changes, and tactical spreads designed to test each pilot's ability to maintain formation integrity under varying conditions. Casey found herself anticipating the lead aircraft's movements, adjusting her position proactively rather than reacting to changes after they occurred. But the real test came during the afternoon's air-to-air combat exercise. Casey was paired against Cadet Robert Kim, whose simulator performance had consistently ranked in the top 10% of their class. The scenario was simple: a 1-versus-1 engagement beginning from neutral positions, with the objective of achieving a simulated missile lock on the opposing aircraft. As Casey strapped into her T-6 for the engagement, she recalled Williams' advice about trusting her instincts rather than overthinking tactical decisions. The analytical approach that had served her well during formation flying might be a liability in the dynamic environment of air combat, where success depended on rapid adaptation to constantly changing conditions. The engagement began with both aircraft climbing to the designated altitude, their paths converging toward the center of the assigned airspace. Casey could see Kim's T-6 in the distance, a small speck against the Texas sky that gradually resolved into the distinctive silhouette of her opponent's aircraft. "Fight's on," announced the range controller, signaling the beginning of combat. Kim immediately executed an aggressive climbing turn, attempting to gain both altitude and position for an advantageous attack. It was a textbook opening move, the kind of tactic that typically succeeded against less experienced opponents. But instead of responding with her own textbook counter, Casey did something unexpected. She dove. While Kim climbed for altitude advantage, Casey pointed her nose toward the ground and accelerated, trading potential energy for kinetic energy in a maneuver that seemed counterintuitive but felt instinctively correct. The T-6's airspeed increased rapidly as she descended, giving her the energy advantage that Kim was trying to gain through altitude. "Interesting choice," Hayes observed from the back seat, her tone neutral but attentive. Kim, committed to his climbing attack, found himself in an awkward position. He had gained altitude but lost airspeed, while Casey had gained speed but sacrificed height. In simulator training, this situation would have been analyzed through energy management calculations and optimal intercept geometry. But in the real aircraft, Casey simply felt what needed to happen next. She pulled her T-6 into a vertical climb, using her accumulated airspeed to rocket upward past Kim's position. The sudden reversal caught him completely off guard, transforming Casey from defender to attacker in a matter of seconds. As she climbed through Kim's altitude, she had a perfect opportunity for a simulated missile shot. "Blue 4 has the shot," she announced, achieving her first air-to-air victory since beginning flight training. The engagement continued for several more minutes, with Kim attempting to reverse the situation through increasingly desperate maneuvers. But Casey had discovered something during that first successful attack. Her analytical mind, when freed from the burden of overthinking, could process tactical situations with remarkable clarity. She seemed to see several moves ahead, anticipating Kim's responses and positioning herself accordingly. When the exercise concluded, Kim's T-6 had been shot down 3 times while Casey had emerged unscathed. It was a complete reversal of her previous performance, the kind of dramatic improvement that demanded explanation. During the post-flight debriefing, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes studied the engagement data with obvious interest. Casey's flight path showed none of the hesitation and uncertainty that had characterized her simulator performance. Instead, her maneuvers were fluid and decisive, each tactical choice flowing naturally from the previous one. "Cadet Martinez," Hayes began, "that was some of the most intuitive flying I've seen from a student pilot. Your energy management was excellent, your tactical timing was precise, and your spatial awareness was outstanding. Where did this come from?" Casey thought about Williams' late-night coaching sessions, his emphasis on trusting instinct over calculation, his belief that her analytical nature could be an asset rather than a liability when properly channeled. "Ma'am, I've been working on trusting my initial tactical instincts, rather than second-guessing every decision. It seems to work better in actual flight than in simulator training." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it. Today's performance suggests you have the potential to be an outstanding combat pilot." As Casey walked across the Laughlin flight line that evening, she felt a transformation that went beyond improved test scores or instructor approval. For the first time since beginning flight training, she understood that she might actually belong in a fighter cockpit. The struggles and failures of the previous months hadn't been signs of inadequate ability, but necessary steps in discovering her own unique approach to aviation. The journey from struggling cadet to competent pilot was far from complete. But Casey Martinez had finally achieved something that had seemed impossible. Just weeks earlier, proof that she could compete with the best pilots in her class. Master Sergeant Williams had been right. The Air Force didn't need another perfect pilot. It needed the first Casey Martinez. 18 months after her breakthrough at Laughlin, Second Lieutenant Casey Martinez found herself at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, home to the 56th Fighter Wing and the most advanced F-16 training program in the world. The desert landscape reminded her of Phoenix, but everything else about her situation had changed dramatically. The struggling cadet who had once been dismissed as crash-landing Casey was now among the top 15% of her pilot training class, earning her a coveted assignment to fighter aircraft. The transition from T-6 trainers to F-16 Fighting Falcons represented more than just a change in aircraft. It was entry into an elite brotherhood where reputation was everything, and past performance meant nothing. Every pilot at Luke had to prove themselves anew in the unforgiving environment of supersonic flight, where mistakes could be measured in fractions of seconds and the margin for error approached zero. Casey's flight instructor at Luke was Major Kevin Walsh, a veteran of over 200 combat missions who had earned his reputation flying close air support missions in Afghanistan. Walsh was known for his ability to identify pilots who possessed the intangible qualities necessary for combat effectiveness, the difference between technically proficient aviators and warriors who could perform under the ultimate pressure. Lieutenant Martinez, Walsh announced during their first briefing, "I don't care what you accomplished in training command. This is the big leagues, where we separate pilots who can fly F-16s from pilots who can fight in F-16s. Your real education starts today." The F-16 was unlike anything Casey had previously experienced. Where the T-6 had been forgiving and predictable, the Fighting Falcon was a thoroughbred that demanded respect and rewarded precision. The aircraft's fly-by-wire flight controls and advanced avionics created a human-machine interface that could amplify both skill and error exponentially. Casey's first solo flight in the F-16 took place on a crystalline Arizona morning, with visibility extending to the distant mountains that formed the horizon around Phoenix. As she taxied toward the runway, she felt the familiar pre-flight anxiety that had characterized her early training, but now it was tempered by hard-earned confidence in her abilities. The takeoff roll was exhilarating and terrifying simultaneously. The F-16's afterburner propelled her down the runway with acceleration that pressed her deep into the ejection seat, the desert landscape blurring past her canopy as the aircraft lifted off and climbed at an angle that seemed almost vertical. Within minutes, she was at 20,000 feet with the entire Phoenix metropolitan area spread beneath her like a detailed map. But the real revelation came during her first air-to-air training mission, a basic fighter maneuvers exercise against an instructor pilot flying a similar F-16. The scenario was designed to introduce new pilots to the capabilities and limitations of their aircraft in a controlled environment. With emphasis on energy management and tactical positioning, Casey's opponent was Captain Lisa Chun, a weapons school graduate whose reputation for aggressive flying had earned her the call sign Viper. Chun was known for exploiting every advantage against student pilots, using her superior experience to demonstrate the gap between textbook knowledge and combat reality. Razor 21, this is Viper 01, Chun announced over the radio as they maneuvered into position for the engagement. "Hope you're ready for a real fight today." Casey checked her instruments and armed her training systems, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied air-to-air combat. But this time, instead of the analytical paralysis that had plagued her early training, She felt a calm focus that seemed to slow down time and sharpen her perception of the tactical situation. "Razor 21 ready," she replied, using her assigned call sign for the first time in an F-16. The engagement began with both aircraft at co-altitude and co-airspeed, separated by 5 miles of empty desert sky. Shun immediately demonstrated why she had earned her reputation, executing a high-G barrel roll that positioned her F-16 for an advantageous attack angle. It was an aggressive opening move designed to put student pilots on the defensive from the very beginning of the fight. But Casey had learned to trust her tactical instincts, and her instincts told her that Chun's aggressive maneuver had created an opportunity as well as a threat. Instead of responding defensively, Casey pulled her F-16 into a vertical climb, trading airspeed for altitude in a maneuver that seemed to concede the initiative to her opponent. Chun, committed to her attack, found herself in the awkward position of trying to engage a target that was climbing away from her optimal firing position. She attempted to match Casey's climb, but the energy she had expended in her opening maneuver left her at a disadvantage in the vertical fight that followed. Casey reached the apex of her climb and rolled inverted, diving back toward the fight. With gravity adding to her accumulated energy, Chun was still climbing, her F-16's nose pointed skyward but her airspeed bleeding away rapidly. As Casey dove past her opponent's position, she had a perfect opportunity for a simulated missile shot. "Razor 21, Fox 2, she announced, indicating a successful heat-seeking missile engagement. "Good kill," Chun acknowledged, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "Reset for another engagement." The pattern repeated itself 3 more times, with Casey using unconventional tactics that seemed to anticipate Chun's responses. Her movements weren't textbook perfect, but they were effective, exploiting the geometry of 3-dimensional combat in ways that defied conventional wisdom, but achieved superior results. After the 4th consecutive victory, Chun called for a debriefing over the radio. "Razor 21, that was some impressive flying. Where did you learn those tactics?" Casey considered the question as she flew information with Chun back toward Luke. The truth was that her tactics weren't learned from any manual or instructor. They emerged from her ability to process multiple variables simultaneously, seeing patterns in the chaos of air combat that allowed her to predict and counter her opponent's moves. "Just trying to think ahead, Viper 01, anticipating what comes next instead of reacting to what just happened." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Those weren't lucky shots." Word of Casey's performance spread quickly through the tight-knit community of Luke's fighter pilots. Success against an experienced instructor like Chun was noteworthy, but the manner of her victories suggested something more significant: the emergence of a pilot whose natural abilities were finally being expressed through appropriate training. And aircraft. Major Walsh approached Casey after her post-flight debriefing, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant, I've been flying F-16s for 12 years, and I've never seen a student pilot adapt to air-to-air combat so quickly. Your tactical instincts are remarkable. Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to apply what I've learned." "What you've learned and what you're doing out there are 2 different things," Walsh replied. "Textbook tactics don't account for the kind of predictive flying you demonstrated today. That's something that can't be taught." Over the following weeks, Casey's reputation continued to grow. Her performances in increasingly complex training scenarios consistently exceeded expectations, earning recognition from instructors who had seen hundreds of student pilots pass through the program. But more importantly, she was developing the kind of tactical intuition that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. The transformation wasn't lost on her former classmates from the academy. James Mitchell, the golden boy, who had once advised her to consider other career options, was also assigned to Luke for F-16 training. When they encountered each other in the squadron briefing room, his reaction was a mixture of surprise and Professional respect, Martinez. I heard you were here, but I figured it was a different Martinez. Didn't expect to see you in fighters. Casey smiled, remembering their last conversation at the academy. Sometimes people surprise you, Mitchell. Sometimes they surprise themselves. Apparently so. I heard you've been tearing up the BFM range. Guess I owe you an apology for that advice I gave you back at the academy. No apology necessary. Everyone has to find their own path. But the most satisfying recognition came in a phone call from Master Sergeant Williams, who had tracked her progress through unofficial channels and called to congratulate her on her performance at Luke. Heard you're making quite an impression out there in Arizona, Williams said, his voice carrying obvious pride. Knew you had it in you from the beginning. I owe it all to you, Master Sergeant. You taught me to trust my instincts instead of fighting against them. I didn't teach you anything, Lieutenant. I just helped you stop getting in your own way. What you're doing out there, that's all you. As Casey hung up the phone, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from struggling cadet to successful fighter pilot. The mockery and dismissal she had endured seemed like ancient history now, replaced by the respect of peers and instructors who recognized her growing capabilities. But she also understood that her real test lay ahead. Training scenarios, no matter how realistic, were still training. The ultimate validation of her transformation would come only when she faced real combat, real threats, and real consequences for failure. That opportunity was closer than she realized. Lieutenant Casey Martinez received her first operational assignment on a humid Thursday morning in September, when the personnel officer at Luke handed her orders that would change the trajectory of her military career. The 421st Fighter Squadron, based at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, was known throughout the Air Force as one of the premier F-16 units, with a combat history dating back to World War II and a reputation for maintaining the highest operational standards in the service. The Black Widows, Major Walsh explained when Casey showed him her assignment orders. You should feel honored, Martinez. They don't take just anyone. Squadron Commander is Colonel Jennifer Blake, one of the best tactical minds in the Air Force. If you can succeed there, you can succeed anywhere. The drive from Arizona to Utah gave Casey time to process the magnitude of her new assignment. Just 2 years earlier, she had been a struggling cadet whose instructors doubted her ability to complete basic training. Now she was heading to an elite operational squadron, where the stakes would be measured not in training scores, but in real-world mission success. Hill Air Force Base sprawled across the Utah desert like a small city, its runways and hangars dwarfed by the massive Wasatch Mountains that formed a dramatic backdrop to the east. The 421st Fighter Squadron occupied a modern complex of buildings near the main flight line, where rows of F-16s sat in various stages of maintenance and preparation for missions that Casey was only beginning to understand. Colonel Blake was exactly what Casey had expected from the Air Force's most successful female squadron commander: professionally immaculate, intellectually sharp, and utterly unimpressed by reputations earned in training environments. Her office walls displayed the accumulated awards and photographs of a career spent pushing the boundaries of what fighter pilots could accomplish. Asterisk, Lieutenant Martinez. Blake began without preamble. I've reviewed your training records from Luke. Impressive performance, but this isn't training anymore. Here, we fly real missions with real consequences. Your job is to learn our procedures, integrate with our team, and prove that you belong among operational fighter pilots. Blake activated a wall-mounted display showing a map of the Pacific region, with various symbols marking friendly and hostile positions. The security situation in the Western Pacific has deteriorated significantly over the past 6 months. Chinese forces have become increasingly aggressive in international airspace, testing our response times and gathering intelligence on our capabilities. We've been tasked with maintaining air superiority patrols and demonstrating American resolve in contested areas. Casey studied the map, noting the proximity of Chinese military bases to American allies in the region. The tactical situation was more complex than anything she had encountered in training, with multiple layers of political and military considerations that could turn routine patrols into international incidents. Your first month will be dedicated to mission qualification training, Blake continued. You'll fly with experienced pilots, learn our tactical procedures, and demonstrate competency in all assigned mission types. Only after completing NQT will you be certified for independent operations. Casey's training partner was Captain Maria Santos, a veteran pilot with over 500 combat hours who had earned her reputation during deployments to the Middle East. Santos possessed the kind of relaxed confidence that came from years of successful operations, but she also maintained the professional vigilance that kept combat pilots alive in hostile environments. Rule number 1, Santos explained during Casey's first briefing, is that everything we do here is for real. The aircraft we fly, the weapons we carry, the threats we face, it's all genuine. Training scenarios prepare you for the basics. But operational flying requires a different mindset entirely. Casey's first operational sortie took place on a crisp October morning, with the Wasatch Mountains painted in autumn colors that created one of the most beautiful flying environments she had ever experienced. Her F-16 was configured for an air superiority patrol, carrying live AIM-120 and AIM-9 missiles that represented actual combat capability rather than training simulations. The mission briefing had been thorough and sobering. Intelligence reports indicated increased Chinese military activity in the South China Sea, with several incidents of aggressive intercepts against American reconnaissance aircraft. Their patrol route would take them along international boundaries, where encounters with foreign military aircraft were considered likely rather than possible. Viper 21, this is Hill Control, announced the tower controller as Casey and Santos taxied toward the runway. You are cleared for takeoff. Good hunting. The phrase sent a chill down Casey's spine. This wasn't a training exercise where poor performance resulted in instructor criticism. This was operational flying where poor performance could result in international incidents or worse. The patrol itself began routinely, with Casey flying in formation with Santos while monitoring radio frequencies and radar displays for signs of hostile activity. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath them, its surface broken only by the occasional commercial vessel or natural weather formation. But after 2 hours of routine patrol, their situation changed dramatically. Viper flight, this is magic. 62, announced an E3 AWACS controller, his voice carrying the controlled urgency that indicated developing threats. I have multiple contacts bearing 270, range 200 miles, heading eastbound at high speed. Count 4 aircraft. Appears to be fighter type. Casey felt her pulse quicken as she processed the information. 4 unidentified fighters approaching at high speed meant either a serious navigation error by friendly forces or deliberate provocation by hostile aircraft. Either way, their routine patrol had just become significantly more interesting. Magic 62, Viper flight copies, Santos responded professionally. Request vector to intercept and rules of engagement. Viper flight, turn left heading 270, climb to flight level 300. IRO is peacetime intercept procedures. Do not arm weapons without authorization from Magic 62. Casey followed Santos through the turn toward the unknown contacts, her F-16's radar automatically beginning its search pattern as they climbed toward their assigned altitude. The aircraft felt different under combat loading, heavier and more purposeful than the training configurations she had grown accustomed to. Viper 22, Santos called over the radio, stay in formation and follow my lead. We're going to execute a standard peacetime intercept. Our job is to identify the contacts and escort them out of international airspace if necessary. As they approached the intercept point, Casey's radar began painting returns from the unknown aircraft. The contacts were flying in tactical formation. At high altitude, their behavior suggesting military rather than commercial aviation. But the real surprise came when the radar's identification system provided additional information about their targets. Viper 21, Magic 62, the AWACS controller announced, his voice now carrying obvious concern. Contacts are identified as Chinese. J-20 stealth fighters. This is the first confirmed sighting of J-20s operating in international waters. Maintain intercept course, but exercise extreme caution. Casey felt her breath catch in her throat. The J-20 was China's most advanced fighter aircraft, a stealth design that represented the cutting edge of Chinese military technology. Very little was known about its capabilities in the American intelligence community, and this encounter would provide crucial information about its performance characteristics. Copy Magic 62, Santos replied, her voice betraying no emotion despite the significance of the encounter. Viper flight continuing intercept. As they closed the distance to the Chinese formation, Casey could see the distinctive silhouettes of the J-20s against the ocean background. The aircraft were larger than F-16s, with angular stealth shaping that made them appear almost alien compared to conventional fighter designs. They flew in perfect formation, their pilots demonstrating the kind of precision that indicated extensive training and professional competence. The intercept proceeded according to established international protocols, with Santos positioning their F-16s alongside the Chinese formation while maintaining safe separation distances. Radio calls went unanswered, but the visual contact allowed both sides to demonstrate their respective capabilities without escalating to hostile actions. But as Casey flew in formation with some of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft, piloted by highly trained foreign adversaries, she realized that her journey from struggling cadet to operational fighter pilot had prepared her for exactly this moment. The analytical skills that had once been criticized as overthinking now allowed her to process the complex tactical situation while maintaining professional composure. The encounter lasted only 12 minutes before the Chinese formation turned away and headed back toward their home bases. But for Casey Martinez, those 12 minutes represented the culmination of everything she had worked toward. Since beginning flight training. She was no longer a student pilot learning to fly. She was a United States Air Force fighter pilot, entrusted with defending American interests against the most sophisticated threats in the world. The real test of her abilities was yet to come. 3 months into her assignment, with the 421st Fighter Squadron, Casey had settled into the rhythm of operational flying when intelligence reports began painting a disturbing picture of escalating tensions in the Pacific. What had started as routine intercepts and patrol missions was evolving into something far more dangerous, with Chinese military forces demonstrating increasingly aggressive tactics that pushed the boundaries of international law. The morning briefing on December 12 marked a turning point in the squadron's operational tempo. Colonel Blake stood before a room packed with pilots, intelligence officers, and operations staff, her expression reflecting the gravity of the situation they now faced. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, activating the briefing room's main display. "The situation in the Western Pacific has deteriorated significantly over the past week. Chinese forces have conducted multiple provocative intercepts of American reconnaissance aircraft, including several incidents that came dangerously close to causing mid-air collisions." The display showed a series of flight paths and radar tracks, each one documenting encounters between American and Chinese aircraft that had grown progressively more aggressive. What had once been professional, if unfriendly, military encounters were now resembling aerial games of chicken that threatened to spiral into actual combat. "More concerning," Blake continued, "is the emergence of a particular Chinese pilot who appears to be leading these aggressive intercepts. Intelligence has designated him Dragon Leader, and his tactical profile suggests someone with exceptional flying skills and a willingness to take extraordinary risks. Casey studied the tactical data showing Dragon Leader's flight patterns, noting the precision and creativity that characterized his maneuvers. Unlike the routine intercept she had experienced during her first months at Hill, this pilot seemed to treat each encounter as an opportunity to demonstrate Chinese air superiority while gathering intelligence on American capabilities. Major Rebecca Torres, the squadron's intelligence officer, stepped forward to provide additional details. Dragon Leader has been identified in 7 separate incidents over the past 3 weeks. In each case, he has demonstrated flight characteristics that exceed normal operational parameters. He's flying his J-20 well beyond published performance envelopes, suggesting either superior aircraft capabilities or exceptional pilot skill. Torres highlighted specific maneuvers on the display, showing flight paths that seem to defy conventional understanding of stealth fighter limitations. Most concerning is his apparent ability to maintain stealth characteristics while conducting aggressive maneuvers. Our sensors have had difficulty tracking him during close-range encounters, which suggests advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Captain Santos, now serving as Casey's regular flying partner, leaned over to whisper, "This guy's making our intercept missions feel like combat sorties." Last week, Johnson's flight had to execute defensive maneuvers when Dragon Leader simulated an attack run. The briefing continued with updates on Chinese military exercises, satellite imagery of expanded base construction, and intelligence assessments that painted a picture of a military force preparing for potential conflict. But Casey found herself focused on the tactical data about Dragon Leader, studying his flight patterns and decision-making with the analytical intensity that had become her trademark. Effective immediately, Blake announced. All intercept missions will be conducted with increased combat readiness. We're authorized to carry full defensive loads, and rules of engagement have been modified to allow for immediate response to hostile actions. The change in operational posture was significant. Instead of flying routine patrols with training mindsets, the squadron was now preparing for the possibility that their next mission could involve actual combat against highly skilled adversaries. Flying state-of-the-art equipment, Casey's first encounter with Dragon Leader came 2 days later, during what should have been a routine patrol along the edge of international airspace. She was flying as Santos wingman when their AWACS controller reported multiple contacts approaching from the west at high speed. "Viper flight, Magic 62, the controller announced. "I have 4 contacts bearing 280, range 150 miles. Climbing through flight level 250. Appears to be military formation. Request vector to intercept." Santos acknowledged the call and turned their F-16s toward the approaching contacts, but something about the situation felt different from previous intercepts. The Chinese aircraft were approaching faster than usual, and their formation was more aggressive, suggesting tactical rather than merely provocative intent. "Viper 22, Santos called over the radio. "Stay alert on this one. Something doesn't feel routine about this intercept." As they approached the intercept point, Casey's radar began painting contacts that appeared and disappeared in patterns that suggested advanced stealth technology. The J-20s were using their low observable characteristics more effectively than in previous encounters, making it difficult to maintain consistent targeting solutions. "Magic 62, Viper 21, Santos reported. "Contacts are intermittent on radar. Appears to be stealth fighters using advanced counter-detection measures." "Copy Viper 21. Continue intercept, but exercise extreme caution. These contacts are displaying unusual flight characteristics." When visual contact was finally established, Casey found herself looking at a formation of 4 J-20s, flying in a tactical spread that maximized their mutual support while maintaining optimal positioning for either defensive or offensive maneuvers. But it was the lead aircraft that captured her attention immediately. The J-20 flew with a precision and confidence that set it apart from the other aircraft in the formation. Its movements were fluid and purposeful, displaying the kind of three-dimensional awareness that characterized only the most exceptional pilots. Even during routine formation flying, the aircraft seemed to radiate competence and barely contained aggression. "That's him," Santos said quietly over the intercom. "That's Dragon Leader." The intercept proceeded according to standard protocols, with the American F-16s taking positions alongside the Chinese formation while attempting to establish radio contact. But Dragon Leader's response was unlike anything Casey had experienced in previous encounters. Instead of maintaining straight and level flight during the intercept, Dragon Leader began executing a series of subtle maneuvers that demonstrated his aircraft's capabilities while testing the Americans' responses. He would climb slightly, forcing the F-16s to match his altitude. He would execute gentle turns that required the Americans to adjust their positions. Each maneuver was technically within acceptable parameters for peaceful intercepts, but the cumulative effect was a masterclass in tactical aviation. "This guy's good," Santos observed as she worked to maintain formation with the maneuvering J-20. "He's turning a routine intercept into a flying lesson." But Casey was analyzing Dragon Leader's techniques with the kind of pattern recognition that had become her specialty. His maneuvers weren't random demonstrations of skill. They were methodical tests of American capabilities and responses. He was gathering intelligence through direct observation, learning how F-16s performed under various flight conditions. The encounter reached its climax when Dragon Leader executed a maneuver that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior during peacetime intercepts. Without warning, he rolled his J-20 inverted and pulled into a steep dive, testing whether the American pilots would follow him into what could be interpreted as an aggressive maneuver. Santos faced a split-second decision: maintain the intercept by following Dragon Leader's dive, or break off contact to avoid escalating the encounter. Her choice to maintain formation and follow the dive demonstrated American resolve, but it also provided Dragon Leader with valuable intelligence about American tactics and pilot training. "Impressive," came a voice over the radio in accented but clear English. It was the first time any Chinese pilot had broken radio silence during an intercept, and the voice carried the confidence of someone who knew he had just demonstrated superior tactical skills. The Chinese formation maintained the intercept for another 8 minutes before turning away and heading back toward their territorial waters. But the encounter had fundamentally changed Casey's understanding of the threats they faced. Dragon Leader wasn't just another foreign military pilot conducting routine operations. He was a highly skilled adversary who was actively preparing for potential combat. During the post-flight debriefing, Casey shared her analysis of Dragon Leader's techniques with the squadron's intelligence team. Her observations about his systematic testing of American responses provided valuable insights into Chinese intelligence gathering methods and tactical development. "Lieutenant Martinez," Colonel Blake said after reviewing Casey's debrief, "your tactical analysis of this encounter is exceptional. I want you to begin developing countermeasures for Dragon Leader's techniques. If we encounter him again, we need to be prepared for more than just routine intercepts." As Casey worked late into the evening, analyzing flight data and developing tactical responses to Dragon Leader's maneuvers, she realized that her journey from struggling cadet to operational fighter pilot had been preparing her for exactly this challenge. The analytical skills that had once held her back were now her greatest asset in developing strategies to counter one of the world's most skilled adversary pilots. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about flying, fighting, and the thin line between peace and war in the modern world. The crisis began at 0347 hours. On a frigid January morning when Chinese forces launched what appeared to be a coordinated probe of American air defenses across multiple sectors of the Pacific. Emergency klaxons wailed across Hill Air Force Base as the 421st Fighter Squadron scrambled to respond to the largest military provocation since the end of the Cold War. Casey rolled out of her bunk and into her flight gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who had drilled for this moment countless times. But as she ran toward the flight line, she understood that this wasn't a drill. The controlled chaos around her, the urgent radio chatter, and the grim expressions on everyone's faces indicated that the long-anticipated confrontation had finally arrived. "This is not a drill," Colonel Blake announced over the squadron's communication system. "Multiple Chinese formations have penetrated international airspace in what appears to be a coordinated intelligence-gathering operation. All available aircraft are being scrambled for immediate response." Casey's F-16 had been loaded with a full combat configuration: AIM-120 radar-guided missiles, AIM-9 heat-seeking missiles, and enough fuel for extended operations. As she completed her pre-flight inspection in record time, she noticed that her hands were steady despite the adrenaline surging through her system. The nervous cadet who had once struggled with basic flying procedures had been replaced by a confident combat pilot ready for whatever lay ahead. "Viper 22, you're flying solo on this one," Captain Santos called out as she prepared her own aircraft 3 parking spots away. "I'm leading Blue Flight to the northern sector. Your assignment is combat air patrol over the central corridor with Viper 33. Casey acknowledged the assignment and strapped into her F-16, running through startup procedures with mechanical precision while her mind processed the tactical situation. Flying solo combat missions represented the ultimate vote of confidence from her squadron commander, recognition that she had evolved from liability to asset in the span of just 8 months. The takeoff was surreal in its normalcy. Despite the crisis that had prompted their scramble, the F-16 lifted off from Hill's runway with the same smooth acceleration that characterized routine training flights. But as Casey climbed toward her assigned patrol altitude, she could see multiple contrails across the western sky that indicated the largest aerial confrontation in decades was developing. "Viper 22, Magic 62, announced the familiar voice of their AWACS controller, but his tone carried an urgency that Casey had never heard before. "I have multiple contacts throughout your sector. Primary threat appears to be a single aircraft operating independently of the main formations. Designate target as Dragon Leader." Casey felt her pulse quicken as she processed the information. Dragon Leader, the adversary pilot she had studied and analyzed for months, was operating alone in her patrol sector. The systematic intelligence gathering and tactical probing had apparently been preparation for this moment, when he would test American defenses in actual combat conditions. "Magic 62, Viper 22 copies," Casey responded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to face. "Request vector to intercept Dragon Leader. Viper 22, turn left heading 260, climb to flight level 320. Target is approximately 80 miles northwest of your position. Appears to be conducting surveillance of our response operations." As Casey turned toward the intercept, she activated her F-16's advanced radar systems and began the methodical process of hunting one of the world's most skilled adversary pilots. Her aircraft sensors painted a complex picture of the tactical environment, with multiple contacts maneuvering throughout the region in patterns that suggested coordinated intelligence gathering rather than aggressive attack. But Dragon Leader was different. His flight path showed the kind of purposeful movement that indicated specific tactical objectives rather than general reconnaissance. He was positioning himself to observe American response procedures while maintaining the option for immediate escape if threatened. "Contact," Casey announced as her radar finally achieved a lock on Dragon Leader's J-20. "Single contact bearing 275. Range 60 miles, altitude 32,000 feet. Target appears to be maintaining patrol pattern." Viper 22, you are cleared to intercept. Rules of engagement are defensive only unless fired upon. Maintain visual identification and escort target out of international airspace. Casey's intercept. Approach was textbook perfect, using her F-16 superior maneuverability to position herself for optimal visual identification while maintaining defensive spacing. But as she closed the distance to Dragon Leader's aircraft, she realized that he was aware of her approach and was using the intercept as another opportunity to gather intelligence. The J-20 began executing subtle maneuvers that forced Casey to demonstrate her aircraft's capabilities while maintaining the intercept. Each turn, climb, and speed change was designed to test her responses and collect data about F-16 performance under operational conditions. But Casey had spent months analyzing Dragon Leader's tactics, and she recognized his intelligence-gathering techniques immediately. Instead of responding predictably to his maneuvers, she began executing countermeasures that denied him the information he was seeking while maintaining the tactical advantage necessary for successful intercept. The aerial chess match continued for 12 minutes, with both pilots demonstrating exceptional skill while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as overtly hostile. But the encounter reached a critical point when Dragon Leader began maneuvering toward a position that would allow him to escape back to Chinese territorial waters with the intelligence he had gathered. Viper 22, Magic 62, the WACS controller, announced with obvious urgency. Additional contacts are approaching your position from the west. Appears to be Chinese rescue formation moving to support Dragon Leader's withdrawal. Casey realized that she had minutes, perhaps seconds, before Dragon Leader would be beyond her ability to intercept. The months of preparation, analysis, and tactical development had led to this moment, when she would either prove herself capable of countering one of the world's most skilled adversary pilots or watch him escape with valuable intelligence about American capabilities. Dragon Leader, Casey announced over the international emergency frequency, abandoning standard intercept protocols in favor of direct communication. This is United States Air Force Viper 22. You are ordered to alter course and depart international airspace immediately. The response came in accented but perfect English. American pilot, you have demonstrated admirable skill during our encounters. But today's lesson is about the limitations of your tactics and technology. Dragon Leader's J-20 suddenly broke from its reconnaissance pattern and executed a maneuver that seemed to defy physics. The stealth fighter rolled inverted and pulled into a vertical climb that should have been impossible at their current airspeed and altitude. But instead of stalling as aerodynamics predicted, the J-20 continued climbing while maintaining perfect control. Casey realized that Dragon Leader was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded every intelligence assessment of J-20 performance. His aircraft was either significantly more advanced than American analysts believed, or he was an exceptional pilot who could extract performance that others couldn't achieve. But instead of being intimidated by the demonstration, Casey felt the calm focus that had characterized her best flying. This was the moment that all her training had prepared her for, a one-on-one engagement against a superior opponent flying superior equipment, where victory would depend on skill, tactics, and the ability to think beyond conventional limitations. Casey pulled her F-16 into its own vertical climb, matching Dragon Leader's maneuver while calculating intercept angles and energy management with the analytical precision that had become her trademark. The two aircraft climbed through 40,000 feet in a vertical dance that tested both pilots' abilities and their aircraft's capabilities. At the apex of the climb, both fighters hung in space for a moment that seemed suspended in time. Dragon Leader's J-20 and Casey's F-16 faced each other across a few hundred yards of thin air, two warriors representing their respective nations' technological and tactical capabilities. Then Dragon Leader made his mistake, confident in his aircraft's superiority, and his own abilities. He attempted a maneuver designed to demonstrate Chinese air superiority while positioning himself for escape. But Casey had analyzed his flying patterns for months, and she recognized the setup for his signature tactical move before he began executing it. Instead of responding defensively as Dragon Leader expected, Casey executed a maneuver that Master Sergeant Williams had taught her years earlier. Trust your instincts and act before your opponent finishes thinking. Her F-16 rolled and dove in a direction that seemed to concede the engagement, but the maneuver positioned her perfectly for a counterattack when Dragon Leader completed his demonstration. As the J-20 finished its complex maneuver and began accelerating toward escape, Casey emerged from her dive with perfect positioning for a missile shot. "Dragon Leader," she announced over the radio, "you have been locked by AIM 120. This engagement is terminated." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then Dragon Leader's voice came back over the radio, carrying a note of respect that hadn't been present in previous encounters. "Impressive American pilot. Today's lesson belongs to you." The J-20 turned away and accelerated toward Chinese territorial waters, leaving Casey alone in the vast Pacific sky with the realization that she had just achieved something that months earlier would have seemed impossible. The struggling cadet who had been mocked for her poor academy grades had successfully intercepted and defeated one of the world's most skilled adversary pilots. "Viper 22, Magic 62, the AWACS controller announced, his voice carrying obvious satisfaction. "Outstanding work. Dragon Leader is departing the area, and all other Chinese contacts are withdrawing. Mission accomplished." As Casey flew back toward Hill Air Force Base, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from struggling student to combat-proven fighter pilot. The mockery and dismissal she had endured seemed like ancient history now, replaced by the knowledge that she had found her place in the world's most demanding profession. Her phone would soon ring with congratulations from Master Sergeant Williams, who had seen her potential when no one else believed. Colonel Blake would recommend her for advanced training and eventual command positions. Her parents would read about her success in newspapers and understand that their faith in her had been justified. But for now, Casey Martinez was content to fly home in the knowledge that she had proven herself where it mattered most, in single combat against the best opponent the world could offer. The girl they had mocked for her academy grades had just saved American lives and protected national security with nothing more than skill, determination, and the willingness to trust her own abilities. Sometimes that was enough to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.